Long before empires rose and fell like waves upon distant shores, a solitary voice whispered through eternity's corridors. It spoke not to kings or conquerors, but to shepherds and nomads, carrying nothing but faith and divine promises. This is the story of a people who challenged every assumption about power, gods, and reality itself. From ancient Ur's bustling markets to Jerusalem's smoking ruins, from the Red Sea's miraculous parting to Babylon's golden palaces, their journey reshaped civilization's understanding of the sacred. Witness how one family's covenant became the foundation for three great religions, how slaves became nation builders, how faith triumphed over impossible odds, and how even catastrophic defeat could not extinguish hope's eternal flame. In the sprawling city of Ur, where ziggurats pierced the sky and merchants from distant lands haggled in crowded bazaars, a man named Abram received a call that would reshape the destiny of humanity. Around 2000 BC, Sumerian culture had flourished for over a millennium. Akkadian empires had risen and fallen, and the sophisticated urban centers of Mesopotamia represented the pinnacle of human achievement. Yet from this cradle of civilization, one family would embark on a journey that would establish principles destined to outlast every earthly kingdom. Ur stood as a marvel of its age. Its massive ziggurat dominated the skyline, while harbors welcomed ships carrying goods from the Indus Valley and the Iranian plateau. Cuneiform tablets document a society of remarkable complexity, legal contracts governing marriage and commerce, mathematical texts revealing advanced astronomy, and literary works that would influence storytelling for millennia. Within this urban sophistication, Abram's family participated in commercial networks that connected Mesopotamia to the wider world. When Abram's family abandoned the security of urban civilization for the uncertainties of semi-nomadic life, they were rejecting the polytheistic worldview that dominated their era. Mesopotamian religion centered on cosmic forces personified as deities who required constant appeasement. Each city maintained patron gods, while regional deities governed storms, fertility, and war. A single being claiming universal authority challenged fundamental assumptions about how the spiritual realm operated. God's call established patterns that would characterize this sacred relationship for millennia. Unlike surrounding polytheistic traditions, this new framework centered on personal communication between divine and human realms. This deity demanded exclusive loyalty while promising blessings that would extend far beyond individual prosperity. Three promises would define Hebrew identity: land stretching from Egypt to the Euphrates, descendants numerous as stars and sand, and blessing that would impact all nations. Canaan presented a landscape of extraordinary diversity. Central hills provided grazing for flocks, while terraced slopes supported olive groves. Coastal plains offered fertile land controlled by Philistine cities, while the Jordan Valley contained settlements controlling trade routes between Egypt and Syria. Geographic complexity meant successful settlement required diplomatic skills as much as strength, since conflicts could escalate beyond any family's capacity to manage. Canaanite religious systems centered on fertility deities, whose worship included practices that would later be condemned. Baal, the storm god, received offerings at high places throughout the hills. Asherah, the mother goddess, was honored through sacred prostitution and ritual feasting. Child sacrifice during crises represented ultimate devotion to deities whose favor might mean survival. These practices reflected worldviews fundamentally incompatible with emerging Hebrew monotheism. Abraham's interactions with local rulers required careful negotiation of grazing rights, water access, and defense arrangements. His agreements with figures like Melchizedek of Salem operated according to honor-shame dynamics governing ancient Near Eastern behavior, where reputation determined a family's ability to survive and prosper. Sacred ceremonies followed patterns documented in Hittite treaties. Cutting animals and passing between their pieces represented self-maledictory oaths, calling down destruction if commitments were violated. Smoking fire pots and blazing torches symbolized divine participation, indicating God himself had undertaken these obligations. This unprecedented arrangement placed divine reputation at stake in promises made to mortal humans. Sarah's barrenness created a crisis that tested faith while revealing Mesopotamian legal wisdom. Her decision to provide Hagar as surrogate followed customs where childless wives arranged children through servants. Tensions arose: Hagar's contempt, Sarah's harsh treatment, Abraham's discomfort, illustrating costs of securing divine promises through human expedience. Ishmael's birth complicated the narrative by raising questions about divine promises and human actions. This son possessed legitimate claims based on inheritance law, yet he was not the child through whom blessings would continue. Tension between justice and grace would echo throughout Hebrew history, as each generation struggled to understand sovereignty interacting with human responsibility. Transformation of Abram into Abraham through divine renaming represented more than identity change. Abram meant exalted father, appropriate for achieved prosperity. Abraham meant father of multitude, pointing toward unfulfilled promises requiring faith. This occurred alongside circumcision as the physical sign marking males as belonging to the chosen people. Unlike other traditions performing circumcision as puberty ritual, Hebrew practice required infant circumcision on the 8th day. This timing emphasized that participation was divine grace rather than human achievement, since infants could not choose status or demonstrate worthiness. Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction revealed moral dimensions while demonstrating divine justice. These Jordan Valley cities had become notorious for practices violating hospitality and justice standards. Abraham's intercession showed that participation carried responsibilities for advocating on behalf of broader humanity, even when thoroughly corrupt. Isaac's binding probed the depths of Abraham's commitment. This command to sacrifice the son through whom promises would be fulfilled created contradictions human logic could not resolve. Mount Moriah would later become Solomon's temple site, establishing connections between patriarchal faith and institutional worship. Provision of substitute sacrifice introduced vicarious atonement principles later developed in Mosaic systems. Sarah's death necessitated the first Hebrew land purchase in Canaan. Abraham negotiated with Hebron's Hittites for burial sites following elaborate diplomatic protocols. Insisting on full payment rather than gifts established legitimate ownership, while demonstrating respect for local customs. Finding Isaac's wife revealed careful attention to preserving cultural and religious identity. Abraham's insistence that Isaac not return to Mesopotamia, while requiring his wife come from ancestral homeland, reflected tension between maintaining family connections and commitment to promised land. Elaborate guidance led to Rebekah, whose immediate response showed faith required for participation. Esau and Jacob's birth introduced conflict that would persist for generations. Oracle during Rebekah's pregnancy predicted the older would serve the younger, reversing inheritance patterns while establishing divine choice over birth order. This principle would repeatedly appear as God chose David over older brothers, Solomon over Adonijah, working through unexpected agents. Esau's birthright sale for stew revealed fundamental value differences between those prioritizing immediate gratification over long-term promises. His rejection wasn't momentary lapse, but consistent pattern, confirmed through Canaanite marriages and indifference to spiritual dimensions. Jacob's deception to secure blessings demonstrated ambiguous human participation in divine plans. While God predicted the older serving younger, Jacob's fraud raised questions about trusting divine timing versus taking initiative. Immediate consequences, Esau's murderous anger and Jacob's exile, suggested manipulation carried significant costs. Bethel's dream established theological foundations for understanding divine presence beyond ancestral shrines. Angels ascending and descending revealed divine activity wasn't confined to specific sites, but could manifest wherever covenant people found themselves. Jacob's stone pillar and worship vows established Bethel's sacred importance. 20 years with Uncle Laban provided education in maintaining covenant identity within alien systems. Laban's household gods represented polytheistic worldviews Jacob's family had abandoned. Conflicts over prosperity and altered agreements demonstrated difficulties maintaining integrity with those lacking covenant standards. Marriages to Leah and Rachel through Laban's deception created family dynamics influencing tribal relationships for centuries. Sister rivalry, expressed through competing for sons, reflected honor-shame culture while establishing tribal structure, formalized during wilderness wandering. Each birth contained prophetic elements, anticipating tribal characteristics. Birth of 12 tribal patriarchs occurred within family conflict testing faith, while revealing divine sovereignty, using flawed relationships for eternal purposes. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi would forfeit leadership through moral failures, while Judah would emerge as the royal line. Joseph and Benjamin would preserve the family during famine, forcing migration to Egypt. Wrestling at Peniel marked patriarchal spiritual development's climax. This mysterious encounter represented Jacob's lifelong struggle to secure divine blessing through personal effort. Physical wounds, leaving permanent limping, reminded that blessing came through submission rather than conquest, while Israel meant he who wrestles with God. Reunion with Esau demonstrated transformation in both brothers. Esau's prosperity showed divine blessing, extending beyond covenant lines, while gracious reception indicated maturity replacing murderous anger. Peaceful separation confirmed distinct destinies despite renewed relationship. Jacob's land purchase at Shechem created connections with local populations, having significant consequences. Dinah's rape and Simeon and Levi's vengeful massacre demonstrated volatility between covenant family and Canaanite neighbors. Jacob's condemnation reflected understanding that covenant people must maintain moral standards, even seeking justice. Journey to Bethel provided spiritual renewal, while establishing that moral crises required return to proven encounter places. Burial of foreign gods and purification rituals indicated Jacob's household had accumulated incompatible practices during Mesopotamian years. Rachel's death during Benjamin's birth created final family tragedy, shaping Jacob's emotional development. Her Bethlehem burial established remembered tomb sites, while Benjamin's survival ensured Rachel's lineage continuation. Jacob's obvious Joseph favoritism would create tensions culminating in events leading to Egyptian sojourn. Joseph's narrative demonstrates divine providence operating through human choices and natural consequences. His dreams of future elevation, shared with tactless enthusiasm, created brother resentment, leading to slavery sale. Yet this tragedy positioned him to acquire administrative skills, enabling family preservation during 7 famine years. multicolored coat symbolizing favoritism reflected inheritance customs, while brother hatred demonstrated parental favoritism's destructive potential. Judah's proposal to sell rather than kill revealed moral complexity while establishing his leadership emergence despite fourth son position. Potiphar's house illustrated challenges when covenant moral standards conflicted with cultural expectations. Joseph's adultery refusal, explained through earthly and divine responsibility, cost position and freedom while demonstrating faithfulness prices. False imprisonment created circumstances bringing court contact enabling elevation. Dream interpretation reflected divine revelation through natural insights rather than occult practices. Success explaining butler and baker visions established reputation for divine wisdom access. Butler forgetfulness demonstrated human gratitude, unreliability, while creating perfect timing for royal availability. Royal dreams of fat cows devoured by thin cows and healthy grain consumed by withered stalks provided symbolic economic cycle representation. Joseph's interpretation, identifying 7 abundance years, followed by 7 famine years, demonstrated revelation's practical nature while providing survival information. Administrative systems managing Egypt's resources revealed divinely inspired expertise combined with servitude experience. Purchasing and storing 1/5 of grain production created famine reserves while generating revenue, transforming ruler-subject relationships. By famine's end, virtually all land belonged to the crown, with people serving as tenant farmers. Jacob's sons arriving to purchase grain initiated complex interactions culminating in family migration. Joseph's recognition, combined with identity concealment, while testing character, revealed understanding that betrayal damaged relationships required careful restoration. Spying accusations, Benjamin demands, and apparent cup theft served as tests determining whether brothers had learned protecting rather than sacrificing vulnerable family members. Judah's slavery offer in Benjamin's place demonstrated character transformation during 20 post-Joseph years. His passionate speech acknowledging guilt while recognizing father's desperate Benjamin love revealed moral growth enabling reconciliation. Joseph's emotional response, finally breaking disguise, showed forgiveness had been the goal throughout testing. Identity revelation and history interpretation as divine providence working through human choices established theological principles influencing Hebrew understanding throughout subsequent history. His declaration that "you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good" recognized both brother actions' moral reality and divine purposes accomplished through them. Invitation for Jacob's entire family reflected filial devotion and royal gratitude for administrative wisdom, preserving Egypt during famine. Goshen allocation demonstrated honored status while providing physical isolation, enabling cultural and religious distinctiveness maintenance during Egyptian sojourn. Jacob's Egypt journey required divine reassurance that migration served covenant purposes rather than abandoning them. Beersheba vision promising great nation development in Egypt while guaranteeing promised land return established theological framework, understanding this sojourn as necessary fulfillment stage. Reunion after 22 years represented patriarchal narrative emotional climax, while demonstrating providence using family tragedy, accomplishing purposes no human planning could achieve. Jacob's declaration that he could die peacefully, having seen Joseph alive, reflected parental love shaping emotional life since Rachel's death. Final 17 years provided opportunity observing grandson development while establishing traditions preserved during Hebrew-Egyptian residence centuries. Joseph's sons' adoption as equal heirs reflected special Joseph love and recognition that Egyptian-born children needed formal community incorporation, ensuring tribal inclusion. Hand-crossing, blessing, Ephraim, and Manasseh continued divine choice patterns operating independently of natural inheritance. Jacob's explanation that younger would become greater anticipated Ephraim's future northern kingdom prominence. Final blessings upon 12 sons combined prophetic insight with poetic artistry, anticipating tribal characteristics and destinies. Reuben's preeminence loss through instability, Simeon and Levi's dispersion through violence, Judah's royal emergence, and Joseph's special blessings established expectations influencing tribal relationships for centuries. Jacob's death at 147 marked patriarchal period's end, while establishing promised land connection precedents despite Egyptian residence. Machpelah burial insistence demonstrated continuing faith, while creating descendant obligations, maintaining distinctive identity rather than complete cultural assimilation. Joseph's death at 110 created transitions setting stage for dramatic events defining Hebrew identity during following centuries. Final words expressing confidence in promised land return, while requiring bone transportation during Exodus maintained promise hope, while acknowledging fulfillment lay in unseen futures. Preservation, according to local practices, reflected successful society integration, while coffin burial, rather than immediate Canaan burial, demonstrated faith in eventual inheritance return. Embalmed body preservation created tangible promise reminders. During prosperity years when assimilation might have seemed more attractive than maintaining Hebrew distinctiveness. Jacob's descendant multiplication fulfilled Abraham's promise that offspring would become numerous as heaven's stars and seashore sand. 12-son tribal structure provided organizational framework, enabling growing population identity maintenance despite centuries in foreign lands with superior cultural attractions and greater advancement opportunities. Promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remained Hebrew identity's driving force, even as circumstances changed dramatically. Land promises, though temporarily suspended, continued shaping expectations, preventing complete assimilation. Descendant promises, visibly fulfilled through rapid growth, encouraged faith in divine commitment. Blessing promises, demonstrated through Egyptian prosperity, provided continuing favor evidence while anticipating future national impact. Patriarchal foundations established theological, cultural, and ethnic groundwork, enabling Hebrew people's survival as distinct communities through 4 foreign resident centuries, while preparing them for dramatic events, transforming them from extended family into nation. Sacred relationships, land promises, tribal structures, and chosen purpose convictions would prove essential during coming challenges. Everything was now positioned for Hebrew history's next great chapter, when prosperity would yield to oppression, when Jacob's descendants would cry for deliverance, and when divine intervention would demonstrate the power of the God who called Abraham from Ur and sustained his family through all vicissitudes of their long journey toward destined inheritance. Promises remained valid, relationships continued, and divine purposes would be fulfilled through whatever means necessary to accomplish what no human strength or wisdom could achieve. The Golden Age died slowly, like a sunset that lingers before surrendering to darkness. 4 centuries after Joseph's triumphant presentation of his family to the royal court, his descendants had multiplied beyond all expectation, exactly as the Almighty had promised Abraham. Yet this very blessing had become their curse. Where once the sight of thriving settlements in Goshen had pleased the crown, Now it struck fear into royal hearts. A new dynasty ruled Egypt, and these rulers knew not Joseph. In the palace corridors, where Joseph had once walked as second only to the king himself, new voices whispered of danger. "Look," they warned, "the people of the children of Abraham have become more and mightier than we." The irony was bitter. The very fertility that marked them as blessed by heaven had marked them for destruction by earthly powers. Each birth that should have brought joy instead brought terror to parents who saw their growing numbers reflected in the increasingly hostile eyes of their hosts. The transformation from guests to slaves happened gradually, then suddenly. Administrative changes stripped away privileges Joseph's family had enjoyed for generations. Property confiscations followed, justified by new laws that made foreign ownership illegal. Construction projects demanded workers, and who better to provide them than the foreigners whose loyalty was questionable? Papyrus Anastasi records the harsh reality. Asiatic peoples bent under Egyptian whips, their backs breaking under impossible quotas of bricks and mortar. But the more severely they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. This biological explosion defied every natural law the oppressors understood. Starving peoples died out. Exhausted workers produced fewer children. Hopeless slaves lost the will to live. Yet here, the opposite occurred. Each new burden seemed to trigger another population surge, each fresh persecution to fuel another generation of births. The sight of pregnant women and nursing mothers throughout Goshen maddened the authorities who had expected their policies to achieve the opposite result. Desperation drove the crown to unthinkable measures. If natural attrition would not reduce their numbers, artificial means would. The order went out to the midwives. Every male child born to these people must die at the moment of birth. Shipra and Puah, whose hands had brought hundreds of children safely into the world, suddenly found themselves appointed as executioners. The very women whose calling was to preserve life were commanded to destroy it. Yet when summoned before the throne to explain their failure to reduce the birth rate, these brave women had their answer ready. "The women are not like the others," they explained with carefully crafted innocence. "They are vigorous and give birth before we can even arrive." Their lies saved countless lives while revealing the divine protection that operated even through deception when innocent blood was at stake. Frustrated by professional resistance, the king escalated to public policy. Every citizen of Egypt was now commanded to seize male infants and cast them into the Nile. The river that had once brought prosperity through Joseph's wise administration would now run red with the blood of children. Genocide had become not just policy, but public duty. In this darkest hour, one woman refused to surrender hope. Jochebed looked at her 3-month-old son and saw not a condemned child, but a gift that heaven itself must protect. The basket she wove with her own hands, waterproofed with tar and pitch, became an ark of faith floating among the reeds. Her daughter Miriam crouched nearby, watching with the intensity of a guardian angel as royal feet approached the water's edge. The princess who discovered the crying infant could have walked away. Royal daughters had no obligation to rescue the children of slaves, especially when that rescue defied her father's explicit commands. But something in the child's cry moved her heart, and in that moment of compassion, the very household that had decreed death became the instrument of preservation. With royal privilege protecting him and royal resources funding his education, the future liberator would grow up in the halls of power, learning the very systems he would one day challenge. Miriam's quick thinking completed the circle of divine irony. "Shall I find you a nurse from among the women?" she asked with calculated innocence. And so Jochebed, who had wept as she placed her son among the reeds, found herself paid by the royal treasury to nurse and raise the child she had never truly lost. In the princess's household, yet under his mother's care, the boy learned two identities that would shape his destiny: the administrative skills of Egypt's elite and the heritage of Abraham's promises. The child grew into a man caught between worlds. Palace education had given him access to Egypt's military academies, engineering schools, and diplomatic protocols. He understood irrigation systems and architectural principles, military formations and siege techniques, tribute collection and population management. Yet secret visits to his people's settlements had shown him the cost of these accomplishments: the broken backs that built monuments, the shortened lives that enriched the crown, the cultural destruction that accompanied economic prosperity. At 40, the internal tension finally erupted into decisive action. Seeing an overseer beating a slave with potentially fatal brutality, he looked this way and that to ensure no witnesses observed, then struck down the attacker and buried him in the sand. Murder was a capital crime in Egypt. But this was something more. It was a declaration that divided loyalties could no longer coexist within a single heart. Discovery came through the very people he thought he was protecting. When he tried to mediate a dispute between two slaves the next day, their response cut him to the quick. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed that man?" The rejection stung more than any royal punishment could have. If his own people questioned his authority, how could he presume to lead them to independence? Flight to Midian brought both refuge and education. The desert became his classroom, as 40 years of shepherding taught him lessons no palace academy could provide. He learned which plants indicated water sources, how to read weather patterns in cloud formations, where to find shelter during sandstorms, and how to move large flocks across hostile terrain. Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, became his wife, connecting him to tribal networks throughout the peninsula while grounding him in the rhythms of nomadic life. The burning bush changed everything. What began as routine investigation of an unusual sight became an encounter that shattered 40 years of comfortable exile. The voice that spoke from the flames identified itself with the same Lord who had called Abraham from Ur, who had wrestled with Jacob at Peniel, who had promised Joseph that his bones would return to the promised land. The time for fulfillment had come, and the reluctant shepherd would be the instrument. Yet every instinct resisted the call. "Who am I, that I should go to the king?" he protested. "Suppose they ask me your name. What shall I tell them? What if they don't believe me? I am slow of speech and tongue." Each objection revealed deep understanding of the challenges involved. Royal courts did not negotiate with runaway murderers. Slave populations did not typically rally behind leaders they had already rejected. Divine missions required human instruments, and this instrument felt profoundly inadequate. The answer came not through reassurance, but through demonstration. The rod that transformed into a serpent, the hand that became leprous and was healed, the water that turned to blood. These signs would provide credentials that no earthly authority could counterfeit. Aaron's appointment as spokesman addressed communication concerns while establishing the priestly partnership that would characterize sacred service for generations. Together, the brothers would present ultimatum to the most powerful monarch on earth. Return to Egypt required immediate confrontation with incomplete obedience. When Zipporah performed emergency circumcision on their son during the journey, she was completing the covenant commitment that 40 years in Midian had allowed to lapse. No uncircumcised man could stand before the throne of heaven as representative of heaven's people. Personal holiness was not optional for public ministry. The first audience with their own people proved encouraging. Desperate circumstances had prepared hearts for any message of hope, regardless of how impossible it might seem. Aaron's demonstration of the signs provided tangible evidence that their God possessed power beyond anything they had previously experienced. For the first time in 4 centuries, Jacob's descendants dared to believe that their servitude might not be permanent. The royal audience proved far more challenging. When Aaron cast down his rod before the throne, and it became a serpent, the court magicians replicated the phenomenon through their own arts. When Aaron's serpent devoured theirs, it suggested superior power, but not necessarily different source. The king's response revealed the arrogance that would characterize negotiations throughout the escalating conflict. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let his people go." What followed was systematic warfare between earthly pride and heavenly authority. Each plague struck with surgical precision at the foundations of royal power, while demonstrating the superiority of Jacob's God over Egypt's deities. The Nile that sustained life became a river of death when turned to blood, challenging Hapi's dominion over Egypt's lifeline. Frogs that covered every surface mocked Heket's fertility blessings. Lice that tormented humans and animals alike humiliated gods of cleanliness and order. After each demonstration, the pattern repeated with maddening consistency. Initial royal capitulation would give way to renewed stubbornness as soon as immediate pressure subsided. "Entreat the Lord to take away the frogs, and I will let the people go," became, "Who is the Lord? I will not let them go," as soon as the plague ended. Pride and economic calculation proved stronger than rational assessment of divine power. The livestock plague revealed divine ability to distinguish between populations, despite their geographic proximity. Throughout Egypt, cattle and sheep died in massive numbers. Yet in Goshen, not a single animal belonging to the people perished. This selective destruction provided unmistakable evidence that supernatural forces were operating according to moral rather than natural principles. Boils followed, afflicting the magicians themselves so severely that they could no longer appear in court to contest divine signs. The priests who legitimized royal authority through daily purification rituals found themselves too unclean to perform their duties. Religious systems that supported political structures collapsed under divine assault. Hail destroyed the flax and barley crops while sparing wheat and spelt that would ripen later, demonstrating precise control over natural forces. Those who feared the warning took their livestock indoors and survived. Those who ignored it watched their animals die in the fields. Even among the oppressors, individual response to divine revelation determined personal outcomes. The locust swarm that followed consumed every green thing that the hail had spared, leaving Egypt's landscape stripped bare. Courtiers who had endured previous plagues in silence finally broke ranks, pleading with their monarch, "How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve their God. Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed?" 3 days of darkness that could be felt provided the perfect metaphor for spiritual blindness that refused to acknowledge divine authority. Throughout Egypt, people groped in supernatural blackness, while the homes of the enslaved enjoyed normal daylight. The demonstration that divine power could extinguish the very sun that royal mythology identified with kingly authority left no doubt about whose will would ultimately prevail. Yet even as catastrophe mounted, royal pride remained unbroken. Each temporary concession, "Only the men may go. You may take your families, but leave your flocks. Go, but don't go very far," revealed the desperate bargaining of power confronted with superior force while refusing to acknowledge defeat. The final plague required faith as much from the people as from their oppressors. Slaughtering lambs and applying blood to doorframes while preparing for hasty departure demanded trust that divine protection would operate exactly as promised. Throughout Goshen, families huddled inside blood-marked houses, while the angel of death passed through Egypt, striking down every firstborn from the crown prince to the prisoner's child. That night, Egypt's resistance finally shattered. The king, who had demanded to know, "Who is the Lord?" now pleaded for blessing from the Lord's servants. "Rise, go out from among my people. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone, and also bless me." 4 centuries of bondage ended not with negotiation or gradual emancipation, but with panicked expulsion as Egypt's survivors thrust gold and silver into departing hands, desperate to speed their exit. 600,000 men, plus their families and possessions, left Egypt in a single night, joined by mixed multitudes of other oppressed peoples who saw in this exodus their own opportunity for liberation. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Organizing, provisioning, and moving perhaps 2 million people with their livestock and possessions. Yet pillars of cloud by day and fire by night provided navigation, while divine provision met every need. The route toward the Red Sea, rather than the shorter coastal road, ensured that the final confrontation would occur where divine power could be most dramatically displayed. When royal second thoughts prompted pursuit by Egypt's army, the people found themselves trapped between advancing chariots and impassable water. 4 centuries of supernatural provision had not prepared them for this moment of apparent abandonment. "It would have been better for us to serve Egypt than to die in the wilderness," they cried, revealing how quickly liberation enthusiasm could transform into despair when circumstances appeared hopeless. The response they received established principles that would govern their relationship with the Almighty throughout their history. "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." The command to move forward into the sea, while walls of water rose on either side, required faith that transcended natural sight. Yet as they walked on dry ground between liquid walls, the same miracle that provided their escape prepared destruction for their pursuers. When Egypt's chariots followed into the seabed, the waters that had parted for the people crashed down upon their oppressors, completing liberation while eliminating any possibility of return to bondage. Miriam's song of triumph that followed wove together praise for divine power with somber recognition of human cost. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." Liberation had required death for their enemies, and even in celebration, the weight of that reality tempered their joy. The wilderness journey that followed tested every assumption about what freedom would mean. Water shortages at Mara and Elim revealed that divine provision operated through faith rather than stored resources. Manna that appeared each morning taught daily dependence, while Sabbath rest established rhythms of trust that transcended immediate need. Military victory over Amalekite raiders demonstrated that divine protection operated through human courage, while supernatural assistance made victory possible. Arrival at Mount Sinai marked transformation from liberated slaves into a constituted nation. The mountain's volcanic phenomena, thunder, lightning, earthquake, and trumpet blasts, created an atmosphere of holy terror that emphasized divine majesty while preparing hearts for revelation reception. 3 days of consecration through washing, fasting, and marital abstinence demonstrated that encountering the divine required careful preparation rather than casual approach. The 10 words spoken from the mountain established foundations for covenant society that would influence legal development throughout human history. Divine authority as exclusive, spiritual worship as essential, sacred names as protected, sacred time as honored, family relationships as respected, human life as valued, marriage commitments as binding, property rights as maintained, truthfulness as required, and contentment as necessary. These principles created moral framework transcending cultural boundaries while maintaining distinctive identity. Detailed ordinances that followed translated fundamental principles into practical applications, covering worship procedures, judicial decisions, property relationships, family responsibilities, and social obligations. The comprehensive nature of this legal system addressed everything from ceremonial requirements to criminal penalties, creating a unified approach to individual and community life. Economic provisions prevented exploitation while maintaining incentives for productivity. Sabbatical release of debt slaves, gleaning rights for the poor, and care for widows and orphans created social safety net without destroying personal responsibility. These regulations demonstrated that divine concern extended beyond ceremonial observance to practical justice in daily relationships. The golden calf crisis revealed how quickly covenant commitment could be abandoned when divine presence seemed absent. While the lawgiver received instructions on the mountain, the people below demanded visible gods who could provide security through tangible representation. Aaron's weak capitulation to popular pressure demonstrated that even spiritual authority could compromise divine standards when faced with determined opposition. Intercession that prevented complete destruction established the role of mediatorial leadership in covenant relationship. The offer to be blotted out of divine records rather than see the nation destroyed revealed selfless commitment that effective guidance required. Covenant renewal that followed emphasized divine mercy, operating alongside divine justice, as broken relationships were restored through repentance and renewed commitment. The tabernacle construction that dominated the final wilderness year created portable sanctuary where divine transcendence could intersect human worship. Every detail of its design, from precious metals to ceremonial procedures, emphasized both divine holiness and divine accessibility. The pillar of cloud that settled upon the completed structure provided visible evidence that heaven had chosen to dwell among this people, despite their failures and rebellions. Census, organization, and tribal arrangement prepared the nation for conquest while establishing military and administrative structures that would govern land distribution. The 40-year delay that followed the spy mission's negative report served divine purposes, even while punishing human faithlessness. A generation that had known slavery died in the wilderness while their children, raised in freedom and trained in divine dependence, prepared to claim the inheritance promised to Abraham. Jordan's eastern bank found the nation camped within sight of their destination. As the aged lawgiver delivered final addresses combining historical review, legal instruction, and prophetic warning. The written Torah that emerged from these speeches established permanent constitution for covenant community while preparing them for settled life under new leadership. Death at 120, with undiminished vigor, demonstrated divine control over human lifespan, while ensuring transition occurred according to divine timing. The unknown burial site prevented shrine development while maintaining focus on covenant relationship rather than human personality. Joshua's succession, carefully prepared through progressive responsibility sharing, validated continuity while providing fresh perspective for changed circumstances. The people who emerged from wilderness bore little resemblance to the slaves who had left Egypt. Where their ancestors had known only oppression and feared freedom, this generation had experienced daily divine provision and developed unshakable confidence in supernatural promises. They possessed comprehensive legal system, unified religious practice, efficient military organization, and absolute conviction that the land before them was their divine inheritance. Everything was positioned for the conquest that would test every lesson learned through 4 decades of divine education, while demonstrating heaven's faithfulness to promises made centuries earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jordan River had never seemed so narrow, nor so impossible to cross. From the eastern bank, where the descendants of Abraham waited in battle formation, the promised land stretched before them like a fever dream, so close they could see smoke rising from Canaanite cities, though separated by waters that ran swift and deep during spring flood season. Joshua, bearing the weight of command that Moses had carried for 40 years, knew that the next few hours would determine whether 4 centuries of heavenly promises would be fulfilled or abandoned at the threshold of their inheritance. The spies' reports from Jericho had transformed fear into faith. Where the previous generation had seen giants and fortified cities as insurmountable obstacles, these scouts saw evidence of divine preparation. Truly, the Almighty has given all the land into our hands, they declared. All the inhabitants of the country are faint-hearted because of us. The prostitute Rahab's testimony confirmed what miraculous victory over Egypt and 40 years of wilderness provision had already established. News of their God's power had spread throughout Canaan, creating the very terror that would make conquest possible. Yet knowing their enemies feared them and actually crossing into hostile territory remained 2 different challenges entirely. The Jordan's swollen waters mocked every conventional wisdom about river crossings. No boats could handle the current during flood season. No fords existed when snow melt from Mount Hermon sent torrents racing toward the Dead Sea. Engineering solutions would require weeks of construction, while alert enemies prepared countermeasures. Divine solutions required only faith, willing to step into impossibility. "Consecrate yourselves," Joshua commanded the priests carrying the sacred ark, "for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." The same ark that had traveled through the wilderness would now lead them into battle, its golden cherubim representing the throne of heaven advancing against earthly kingdoms. When the priest's feet touched the river's edge, the waters gathered into a heap upstream, while the riverbed dried to make a highway for the advancing nation. The miracle that had delivered them from Egypt would be repeated to deliver them into their inheritance. 12 stones pulled from the Jordan's depths became a memorial at Gilgal, where Joshua explained to future generations what their eyes would never see. When your children ask in time to come, "What do these stones mean?" then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant. Memory would be as important as conquest in the struggle to maintain identity amid the cultural pressures of settled life in Canaan. Jericho's walls had stood for over 1,000 years, their double fortifications creating a barrier that ancient Near Eastern siege techniques could not breach. The massive stone foundations supported mud brick superstructures rising over 30 feet high, with residential districts built directly into the wall's interior spaces. Attacking such fortifications with Bronze Age weapons would have required years of patient siege work, while defenders rained arrows, stones, and burning oil upon attackers below. Divine warfare operated according to different principles than human strategy. The command to march around the city once daily for 6 days while priests blew ram's horns seemed like lunacy to conventional military thinking. No general would expose his entire army to enemy observation while accomplishing nothing tactically useful. Faith required obedience, even when celestial commands appeared counterproductive by earthly standards. On the seventh day, the pattern changed. 7 circuits around the walls, while priests maintained continuous trumpet blasts, created a crescendo of sound that culminated in the great shout from hundreds of thousands of voices. The walls that had protected Jericho for a millennium collapsed as though struck by supernatural earthquake, creating rubble ramps that transformed impregnable barriers into assault routes. Only Rahab's house, built into the wall where the scarlet cord hung from her window, remained intact amid the universal destruction. The devoted ban that followed Jericho's fall introduced principles of holy war that would govern conquest throughout Canaan. Everything within the city was either destroyed or consecrated to divine service. No personal enrichment could contaminate victory achieved through supernatural intervention. Achan's secret appropriation of gold and silver violated this principle, bringing divine judgment upon the entire community until individual sin was identified and eliminated through execution. AI's initial defeat revealed how quickly heavenly favor could be withdrawn when covenant obligations were ignored. Joshua's prostration before the ark, demanding to know why the Almighty had brought them across Jordan only to deliver them to destruction, demonstrated the intimate relationship between divine presence and military success. Once Achan's sin was purged, Ai fell to a carefully orchestrated ambush that combined human tactical skill with strategic guidance from above. The Gibeonite deception tested wisdom as much as warfare, when representatives from this powerful city-state appeared in worn clothing, carrying moldy bread, claiming to have traveled from distant lands to make alliance with the famous conquerors. Joshua's failure to consult divine guidance before accepting their peace treaty created complications that would persist for centuries. Discovery that Gibeon lay within the territory designated for conquest forced difficult decisions about honoring agreements made through deception while maintaining divine commands about Canaanite elimination. The Southern Coalition's response to Gibeonite alliance precipitated the most remarkable battle in ancient military history. When 5 kings besieged Gibeon to punish their submission to the invaders, Joshua found himself obligated to honor treaty commitments to protect people he had never intended to spare. The forced march through mountain terrain during a single night brought relief forces to Gibeon's walls just as the city's defenses approached collapse. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Aijalon. The cosmic intervention that prolonged daylight enabled complete victory over fleeing enemies, while demonstrating divine authority over natural forces that pagan peoples worshipped as deities. Hailstones from heaven killed more enemies than weapons wielded by human hands, emphasizing that victory belonged to the Lord, rather than to superior human strategy or equipment. The cave at Makkedah, where the 5 kings hid, became their tomb as Joshua's commanders placed their feet upon royal necks before executing sentence. This symbolic gesture, borrowed from ancient Near Eastern victory rituals, proclaimed the subjugation of earthly authority to divine kingship, while encouraging troops who would face similar opponents throughout the continuing campaign. Northern coalition forces under Jabin of Hazor presented different challenges than southern enemies had posed. These kings commanded chariot squadrons and iron weapons that represented cutting-edge military technology, while their alliance encompassed territories from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan Valley. Hazor itself covered enormous territory, making it one of Canaan's largest and most formidable cities. The pre-dawn assault at the waters of Merom caught enemy forces while they were still organizing their formations, turning technological advantages into liabilities as chariots became obstacles rather than assets on broken terrain. Joshua's decision to hamstring captured horses, rather than incorporating them into his own forces, demonstrated continued reliance on divine power, rather than conventional military assets. Victory belonged to faith, not to superior equipment. Yet even spectacular divine interventions could not complete conquest overnight. The summary statement that Joshua took the whole land described strategic control rather than total occupation. Canaanite populations survived in many areas, creating the conditions for cultural and religious conflict that would characterize the subsequent period. The incomplete nature of conquest would prove both blessing and curse, providing opportunities for cultural enrichment while creating constant temptation for spiritual compromise. Tribal allotments distributed at Shiloh created the territorial framework that would define identity for the next 8 centuries. The elaborate ceremony of casting lots before the sacred tent emphasized divine rather than human determination of boundaries, while detailed border descriptions established permanent claims that would survive political upheavals and foreign conquests. Caleb's inheritance of Hebron rewarded the faith he had demonstrated 45 years earlier during the original spy mission, proving that divine memory extended across generations. Cities of refuge provided sanctuary for accidental killers, while ensuring that intentional murderers faced appropriate justice. This legal innovation balanced mercy with justice, while demonstrating that divine law protected the innocent even when circumstances appeared to condemn them. The requirement that refugees remain in their designated cities until the high priest's death created temporal limits on sanctuary, while maintaining permanent distinction between accidental and intentional homicide. Levitical cities distributed throughout every tribal territory ensured religious instruction and judicial administration in every region, while providing economic support for priestly families through tithe collection and offering reception. This arrangement prevented religious centralization that might disconnect worship from daily life, while ensuring that divine law would be consistently interpreted and applied across all tribal boundaries. Joshua's final assembly at Shechem forced decisive choice between exclusive worship of the Lord and accommodation with Canaanite religious practices. His challenge, choose this day whom you will serve, acknowledged that settlement in Canaan would create constant pressure for religious compromise, while demanding explicit commitment to covenant faithfulness. The covenant renewal ceremony that followed established written constitution for tribal confederation, while creating accountability for future apostasy. The great stone set up beneath the oak at Shechem bore witness to promises made in the shadow of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Moses had commanded the tribes to pronounce blessings and curses upon covenant obedience and disobedience. This memorial would remind future generations that their ancestors had explicitly chosen exclusive allegiance to the Lord, despite knowing the cultural costs such commitment would require. Joshua's death at 110 marked the end of unified leadership and the beginning of tribal confederation that would test every principle established during conquest. The generation that had experienced miraculous victories and divine provision gradually gave way to their children, who knew divine power only through inherited stories rather than personal experience. Cultural pressures that had been successfully resisted during war intensified during peace as intermarriage. Commercial relationships and agricultural cooperation created daily contact with Canaanite neighbors. The pattern that would define the next 2 centuries began almost immediately. Incomplete conquest left Canaanite populations intact throughout the tribal territories, creating constant temptation for religious and cultural accommodation. The agricultural techniques that produced abundant harvests seemed closely connected to fertility rituals honoring Baal and Asherah, while trade relationships required participation in festivals and ceremonies that honored local deities. Gradual apostasy followed as practical considerations overcame religious convictions. Divine judgment came through the very peoples the tribes had failed to eliminate completely. Canaanite kings who had survived as tributaries found opportunities to reverse their subordinate status when their former conquerors abandoned the divine allegiance that had made victory possible. Raids, tribute demands, and territorial losses created the oppression that would drive the tribes back to the Lord in desperate prayer for deliverance. This cycle would repeat throughout the Judges period with maddening consistency. Apostasy leading to oppression, oppression driving repentance, repentance bringing deliverance, deliverance resulting in peace, and peace breeding complacency that led to renewed apostasy. Each turn of the wheel seemed to dig the pattern deeper, making escape increasingly difficult while demonstrating both divine patience and human weakness. When crises emerged that threatened tribal survival, the Spirit of the Lord would empower individuals with gifts for military leadership, political organization, or judicial wisdom needed to address specific challenges. These judges were not hereditary rulers, but charismatic leaders whose authority derived from divine calling rather than human appointment. Their emergence followed no predictable pattern, except divine sovereignty, choosing instruments according to heavenly rather than earthly criteria. Othniel's victory over Cushan-Rishathaim of Mesopotamia established the template that would characterize divine deliverance throughout this period. When the tribes cried out in genuine repentance, supernatural assistance enabled inferior forces to defeat superior enemies, resulting in periods of peace and prosperity that would gradually erode spiritual vigilance until the cycle repeated. The land had rest 40 years under Othniel's leadership, but his death brought renewed testing. Ehud's assassination of Eglon demonstrated divine humor, operating through unlikely instruments while accomplishing serious political purposes. The left-handed judge from Benjamin approached the Moabite king with a hidden dagger, while his bodyguards assumed that anyone bringing tribute would hardly pose personal threat. The gruesome details of Eglon's death emphasized divine ability to use physical weakness to overcome earthly strength, while eliminating oppression through individual courage. The rallying of tribal forces following Eglon's death revealed both the Confederation's potential and its limitations. When leadership emerged that could unite scattered tribes around common cause, their combined strength proved formidable against foreign oppression. Yet maintaining such unity required constant effort and shared vision that proved difficult to sustain during peaceful periods when local interests overshadowed national concerns. Deborah's emergence as prophet and judge shattered conventional assumptions about leadership qualifications while demonstrating divine willingness to work through any instrument that would respond to heavenly calling. Her position beneath the palm tree between Ramah and Bethel became a judicial center where tribes brought disputes requiring wisdom beyond local resources. More remarkably, her authority extended to military command when crisis demanded action that male leaders were reluctant to undertake. Barak's hesitation to face Sisera's iron chariots without Deborah's direct participation revealed how thoroughly Canaanite military technology intimidated tribal forces, equipped primarily with bronze weapons and agricultural tools. The 900 iron chariots commanded by Sisera represented overwhelming technological superiority that could control entire regions through superior mobility and striking power. Yet Deborah's faith transcended conventional military calculations as she proclaimed divine intention to deliver the entire host into their hands. The battle at Mount Tabor demonstrated divine mastery over natural forces, as unexpected rainfall turned the Jezreel Valley into a muddy swamp, where chariots became liabilities rather than assets. Sisera's forces found their technological advantages neutralized by weather conditions that favored infantry operations while eliminating cavalry mobility. The Kishon River, swollen by sudden downpours, swept away fleeing soldiers, while divine intervention completed what human courage had begun. Jael's execution of Sisera in her tent introduced moral complexities that would characterize the entire Judges period. Her violation of hospitality laws to kill a guest seeking protection demonstrated that conventional ethics sometimes conflicted with divine purposes, while her deception and brutality raised questions about appropriate methods for achieving just ends. Yet her decisive action eliminated a threat that could have regrouped scattered forces for renewed assault, earning her praise in Deborah's victory song. Gideon's calling revealed divine preference for weak instruments that would give heaven, rather than human strength, credit for victory. His threshing wheat in a winepress to hide from Midianite raiders demonstrated the fear that gripped the tribes after 7 years of devastating attacks that destroyed crops, livestock, and economic security. The angel's greeting, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor," seemed to mock current circumstances while prophesying future transformation. The fleece tests that followed showed honest doubt, struggling with divine calling, as Gideon sought confirmation that heaven truly intended to use someone as insignificant as himself to deliver the entire nation. Divine patience with these requests for additional signs demonstrated understanding of human limitations, while providing assurance that would sustain faith during the impossible challenges ahead. The army reduction from 32,000 to 300 eliminated any possibility that human strength would receive credit for victory over the Midianite horde. Divine strategy deliberately handicapped the attacking force to emphasize supernatural intervention, while testing faith to its absolute limits. The selection process that retained only men who remained alert while drinking revealed divine attention to character details that human recruitment would overlook. The midnight assault with torches, trumpets, and breaking jars created psychological rather than physical victory as confusion spread through enemy camp. Midianite forces, awakened by sudden noise and light, attacked each other in darkness, while divine terror multiplied natural disorientation. Gideon's 300 became instruments of panic rather than combat, as superior enemy numbers became disadvantages when turned against themselves. The offer of kingship that concluded Gideon's career tested whether successful leadership would corrupt divine purpose through human ambition. His rejection of hereditary monarchy, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you," established the theological principle that divine kingship precluded human dynasty. Yet his creation of an ephod that became an object of worship revealed how quickly religious innovations could become spiritual snares. Abimelech's brutal rise to power through murdering his 70 brothers demonstrated the political chaos that followed effective leadership when no institutional mechanisms existed for peaceful succession. His reliance on foreign mercenaries and Shechem's support revealed how quickly tribal confederation could fragment when self-interest overcame shared identity. The civil war that consumed his reign showed Confederation's capacity for self-destruction when competing ambitions replaced common purpose. Samson's supernatural strength represented divine power operating through deeply flawed human character in ways that demonstrated both heaven's sovereignty and human responsibility. His Nazirite calling from birth established him as consecrated for divine purposes, while his emotional weaknesses and moral failures showed that spiritual gifts did not automatically produce spiritual maturity. The personal vendettas that drove his conflict with Philistine oppression escalated into guerrilla warfare that terrorized enemy settlements. The riddle at his wedding feast revealed the personal animosity that would drive larger political struggle between emerging iron technology and traditional Bronze Age culture. Samson's revenge for his wife's betrayal demonstrated that individual action could challenge foreign oppression, even when tribal confederation failed to provide unified resistance. His increasing recklessness with divine gifts foreshadowed the tragic conclusion that would result from treating sacred calling as personal possession rather than divine trust. Delilah's seduction succeeded where Philistine armies had failed by exploiting emotional vulnerabilities that physical strength could not protect. Samson's gradual revelation of his strength's source revealed the spiritual blindness that accompanied moral compromise as he failed to recognize divine departure until supernatural power had already withdrawn. His final victory in Dagon's temple cost his life, while eliminating more Philistine leaders than his entire previous career had achieved. 2 centuries of this cyclical pattern revealed both the possibilities and limitations of decentralized government under divine authority. When spiritual commitment remained strong and external pressures stayed manageable, the system had provided effective leadership while preserving individual tribal identity. When faith weakened and enemies organized, Confederation had proved inadequate for national survival. The rise of Philistine power along the coastal plain created external pressure that would eventually force tribal confederation to abandon decentralized leadership in favor of monarchical institutions that could provide unified resistance to organized enemies. Iron weapons and urban fortifications gave Philistine city-states decisive advantages over tribal forces armed with bronze implements and limited siege capabilities. Their systematic expansion inland threatened to divide tribal territories while establishing permanent footholds in the hill country. Economic transformation accompanied political fragmentation as tribes adapted to agricultural life that required different skills than nomadic pastoralism had demanded. Terraced hillsides supported olive groves and vineyards, while valley settlements produced grain surpluses that enabled population growth and craft specialization. Iron technology gradually replaced bronze implements as Philistine metalworking techniques spread through peaceful commerce despite military hostility. Cultural synthesis proved as challenging as technological adaptation, as Canaanite influence on language, law, and religious practice increased through intermarriage and commercial contact. The names that appeared among tribal leaders reflected linguistic borrowing, while legal procedures incorporated local customs that modified traditional patterns. Religious practices absorbed elements from fertility cults while maintaining formal allegiance to the Lord. The Confederation's greatest weakness remained internal division that prevented coordinated response to external threats. Tribal jealousies, territorial disputes, and competing loyalties created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through diplomatic manipulation as effectively as military pressure. The very diversity that had once been source of strength became liability when unity required subordination of local interests to national priorities. Religious deterioration accompanied political fragmentation as local shrines competed with central sanctuary, while private religious practices replaced corporate worship. The proliferation of household gods, neighborhood altars, and regional festivals created religious pluralism that undermined exclusive loyalty to the Lord, while accommodating diverse spiritual needs that official religion failed to address adequately. Samuel's emergence as prophet and judge represented divine response to institutional collapse through charismatic leadership that could transcend tribal boundaries while maintaining religious authority. His annual circuit between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah created a judicial system that provided consistent legal interpretation, while his prophetic ministry preserved divine communication when formal religious institutions had lost moral credibility. The Philistine crisis that would climax Samuel's career began with the disastrous battle at Aphek, where the ark itself was captured and the priestly line of Eli was virtually eliminated. The psychological impact of losing their most sacred symbol while suffering devastating military defeat created national trauma that conventional solutions could not address. Even the ark's miraculous return, after causing plagues in Philistine cities, could not restore confidence in traditional leadership structures. Popular pressure for institutional change intensified as Philistine raids penetrated deeper into tribal territories, while Confederation mechanisms proved helpless to coordinate effective resistance. The demand came with brutal clarity. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations. This request revealed both realistic assessment of political necessities and dangerous willingness to abandon distinctive identity in pursuit of conventional solutions to unconventional challenges. Samuel's warning about the cost of kingship, conscription, taxation, forced labor, and loss of tribal autonomy accurately predicted the challenges that would follow. Yet the people's response was unequivocal. We will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. The stage was set for transformation that would create unified monarchy capable of challenging surrounding powers while maintaining covenant relationship with the Lord. The transition would test whether institutional authority could preserve spiritual heritage that charismatic leadership had maintained, and whether national unity could coexist with divine allegiance that transcended earthly political arrangements. 200 years of tribal confederation had demonstrated that freedom required more than liberation from oppression. It demanded institutions capable of preserving independence against organized enemies, while maintaining the distinctive identity that made such independence worthwhile. The descendants of Abraham stood at another crossroads, choosing between the comfortable chaos of familiar failure and the uncertain promise of unprecedented transformation. The old prophet Samuel stood before the assembled elders at Ramah, his weathered hands trembling not from age, but from righteous anger. For decades he had judged Israel with integrity, traveling his circuit between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, settling disputes and preserving justice. Now these same men who had sought his wisdom were rejecting everything he represented. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations, they demanded, their voices carrying the desperation of a people who had lost faith in their own distinctiveness. The irony cut deep. These were the descendants of slaves who had been liberated precisely because they were not like other nations. Their God had brought them out of Egypt, sustained them in wilderness, and given them triumph over enemies, specifically so they could demonstrate a different way of living, a society governed by heavenly law rather than mortal ambition. Now they stood before him, begging to surrender the very freedom that had cost so much blood and sacrifice to achieve. Samuel's warning came with prophetic clarity that would prove hauntingly accurate. This will be the manner of the king who will reign over you, he declared. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over thousands and captains over 50s, will set others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and others to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. The catalogue of royal prerogatives continued relentlessly. Taxation, conscription, confiscation, forced labor. Everything that bondage had taught them to despise would be replicated under their own king. The freedom their ancestors had died to secure would be voluntarily surrendered for the illusion of security. When Samuel finished his warning, the people's response exposed how completely fear had overcome faith. No, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Heaven's response came with resigned acceptance of mortal stubbornness. Hearken to their voice and make them a king. If the people insisted on learning through bitter experience what they refused to accept through prophetic instruction, then experience would be their teacher. The monarchy they demanded would be given to them, complete with all the consequences Samuel had predicted. Saul's selection seemed almost accidental. A young man from Benjamin, searching for his father's lost donkeys, who encountered the prophet pursuing his mundane task, standing head and shoulders above his countrymen, possessing the physical presence that impressed people who equated size with strength. He appeared to be exactly what the nation thought it needed. His initial reluctance, hiding among the baggage when Samuel called him forward, suggested humility that might survive the corrupting influence of power. Confirmation came through lots cast before the assembled nation, the sacred ritual that had guided decision-making since Joshua's time. When Saul's name emerged from the selection process, it carried the legitimacy that popular acclaim alone could never provide. "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen?" Samuel announced. "There is none like him among all the people." The great shout that arose, "God save the king," marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Saul's reign began not with triumph, but with crisis that tested whether the new monarchy could accomplish what loose Confederation had failed to achieve. The Ammonite siege of Jabesh-Gilead provided the perfect opportunity for the untested king to prove his worth. Nahash, the Ammonite's brutal ultimatum, "Surrender, and have your right eyes gouged out as a reproach to all Israel," represented exactly the kind of organized oppression that had driven the people to demand royal authority. The spirit of the Almighty that came upon Saul transformed a reluctant farmer into a commander capable of inspiring unified action across clan boundaries. His dismemberment of oxen and distribution of the pieces throughout Israel, with the message, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel, so it shall be done to his oxen," proved the authority to compel cooperation that judges had never possessed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 330,000 men assembled for war, the largest force Israel had ever fielded. The dawn assault on Ammonite positions achieved complete surprise through tactics that exploited unified command. Where loose Confederation had struggled to coordinate even simple operations, monarchical authority enabled complex maneuvers that divided enemy troops into isolated groups. Not two of them were left together, the chronicler recorded, describing devastation so complete that Ammonite power was eliminated as a regional threat. Celebrations at Gilgal marked the formal establishment of the monarchy through ceremonies that acknowledged both popular will and prophetic authority. Samuel's farewell address reviewed the history that had brought them to this moment, through challenges that tested covenant faithfulness despite institutional change. "If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice, and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God." The thunderstorm that followed Samuel's prayer provided supernatural punctuation to his warning, through demonstrations that heavenly authority transcended earthly institutions. Monarchy might satisfy popular demand for conventional guidance, but it could not exempt the nation from spiritual responsibilities that had governed their relationship with God since Sinai. The crown carried sacred sanction, but it also carried accountability that no mortal could escape. Saul's early campaigns fulfilled popular expectations through victories that exposed both the possibilities and limitations of monarchical power. The success against Philistine garrisons that began with Jonathan's bold assault at Michmash proved royal ability to inspire coordinated resistance to foreign occupation. When Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed 20 Philistines in their initial attack, the psychological impact spread panic throughout enemy ranks as supernatural intervention through earthquake completed what courage had begun. The prohibition against eating during pursuit produced the first serious conflict between royal authority and sacred law. Saul's oath that cursed anyone who tasted food before evening seemed designed to maintain focus, but it nearly cost Jonathan's life when he unwittingly violated the command by eating honey found in the forest. Only popular intervention prevented the execution of the very hero whose faith had made success possible, exposing dangerous rigidity in royal decision-making that mistook legal compliance for spiritual wisdom. The Amalekite campaign exposed the fundamental tension between monarchical pragmatism and prophetic demands that would ultimately destroy Saul's reign. Samuel's command was unambiguous. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. This was holy war in its most uncompromising form, requiring complete obedience to heavenly commands, regardless of apparent economic or political advantages. Saul's partial compliance exposed the calculating mind that weighed sacred commands against practical considerations. He destroyed the weak and worthless animals, but preserved the best livestock, eliminated common people, but spared King Agag, fulfilled the letter of instruction, though violating its spirit. His explanation to Samuel, "I have performed the commandment of the Lord," proved self-deception that refused to acknowledge selective obedience as disobedience. Samuel's response shattered any illusion that favor could be maintained through partial compliance. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king. The execution of Agag that followed proved prophetic authority, superseding royal prerogatives through grim foreshadowing of judgments that would fall upon the monarchy itself. Samuel's declaration, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women," preceded the brutal dismemberment that eliminated the Amalekite threat Saul had been unwilling to destroy completely. Spiritual consequences of royal failure became evident immediately as the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, though a distressing spirit took its place. The charismatic authority that had enabled early victories evaporated, leaving behind institutional power without sacred sanction. Saul remained king in name, but his ability to inspire confidence or achieve decisive results steadily eroded as mental instability undermined political effectiveness. David's introduction to court came through musical therapy rather than prowess in battle, the young shepherd's harp providing temporary relief for the tormented king. Even in this seemingly innocent relationship, the seeds of future conflict were already present. The same spirit that had departed from Saul was already working through his intended replacement, producing inevitable tension between declining and ascending authority. The Philistine challenge at Elah produced the stage for transformation that would capture the imagination of every subsequent generation. Goliath's daily defiance: "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us," represented exactly the kind of conventional warfare where superior technology and individual champions determined political outcomes. For 40 days, the armies faced each other across the valley as Goliath's challenge remained unanswered, proving the psychological paralysis that gripped Israel when confronted with enemies who possessed advantages in equipment, training, and experience. Saul's offer of royal reward, his daughter in marriage, exemption from taxation, and elevation to nobility found no takers among professional warriors who understood the practical impossibility of defeating a champion whose armor alone weighed more than most men could carry. David's arrival with provisions for his brothers placed him in position to hear what others had heard for weeks without response. Where veteran soldiers saw insurmountable obstacles, the shepherd boy saw opportunity for sacred vindication. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The question exposed fundamental differences in perspective that would characterize his entire career: faith that transcended rational calculation. The confrontation with Saul that preceded the battle tested whether royal authority could quench heavenly calling. David's declaration that he had killed lions and bears protecting his flocks served as more than credentials for courage. It was testimony to supernatural protection that operated outside conventional structures. "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul's armor offered in desperate hope that equipment might compensate for experience, proved useless for warfare that would be decided by faith rather than technology. David's rejection of conventional weapons in favor of shepherd's tools, staff, sling, and 5 smooth stones proved confidence in heavenly intervention that required no mortal supplements. The battle would prove whose God was real. The duel itself lasted only moments, but its consequences would reshape the ancient world. David's stone, driven by supernatural accuracy, found the one vulnerable spot in Goliath's armor, as the giant's own sword provided the instrument for his decapitation. The Philistine champion who had terrorized Israel's army was destroyed by a weapon no warrior would have considered effective, wielded by a boy no recruiter would have accepted. The rout that followed exposed the psychological foundations of ancient warfare, where confidence in command determined effectiveness more than numerical superiority or technological advantage. Philistine troops that had seemed invincible as their champion stood triumphant, fled in panic, when his death proved their gods powerless. Israeli pursuit extended to the gates of Ekron and Gath, transforming defensive warfare into offensive conquest that shifted regional power balance. Popular acclaim for David's triumph produced the first serious threat to Saul's political survival. "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s, the women sang as they celebrated the returning army. The comparison that seemed innocent to those who voiced it struck Saul as seditious, exposing dangerous popularity that could easily become political challenge. From that day forward, the king who had sought security through monarchy found his throne threatened by the very success he needed to maintain legitimacy. The deteriorating relationship between Saul and David illustrated the tragic consequences of spiritual failure, compounded by political paranoia. Twice, Saul hurled his spear at David as the young man played music to soothe royal torment, transforming therapeutic sessions into assassination attempts. Jonathan's friendship with David produced additional strain, as the crown prince's loyalty to his father conflicted with his recognition that heavenly favor had shifted to the shepherd boy. David's successes only intensified royal jealousy, as they proved that blessing had indeed departed from Saul. Every accomplishment that should have strengthened the monarchy instead highlighted the contrast between what Israel could achieve under sacred favor and what it suffered under rejection. The offer of Michal in marriage, presented as royal reward but intended as death trap, backfired when David's success in killing 200 Philistines for her bride price proved supernatural protection that no scheme could overcome. The massacre at Nob represented the complete moral collapse of Saul's reign, as paranoid suspicion led to the slaughter of 85 priests who had provided innocent assistance to David's flight. Doeg the Edomite's willingness to kill those whom Saul's own servants refused to harm exposed how thoroughly foreign influence had corrupted royal administration. The destruction of an entire priestly family for the imagined crime of supporting pretenders to the throne eliminated one of the few remaining restraints on royal tyranny. David's years as an outlaw built the organization and political relationships that would enable his eventual rise to power. The 400 men who initially joined him, debtors, dissidents, and desperate men, formed the core of a professional army loyal to personal guidance rather than institutional authority. Their raids against common enemies during protection of Israelite settlements proved the kind of effective governance that royal administration had failed to provide. The encounter at En-Gedi, where David spared Saul's life despite having perfect opportunity for assassination, exposed character that distinguished him from conventional political rivals. "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." This restraint reflected not political calculation, but spiritual conviction that sacred appointment produced responsibilities that transcended personal grievances. Saul's temporary reconciliation following the En-Gedi incident proved his recognition of David's eventual succession, though exposing his inability to overcome the jealousy that was destroying him. "I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand," he acknowledged, then continued pursuing policies that made peaceful transition impossible. The cycle of pursuit and reprieve that characterized their relationship illustrated the tragic spectacle of a man fighting against the very will he claimed to serve. The Philistine resurgence that culminated in the Battle of Mount Gilboa found Saul increasingly desperate for guidance that would no longer come. Samuel's death had eliminated the prophetic voice that might have provided direction, as the massacre at Nob had destroyed the priestly mediation that might have secured favor. The king, who had demanded monarchy to provide security, found himself isolated from every source of wisdom when crisis demanded supernatural intervention. The consultation with the medium at Endor represented the ultimate apostasy, as Saul sought through occult practices the communication his disobedience had forfeited. Samuel's posthumous appearance brought not comfort, but condemnation. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." The prophet, who had anointed Saul as king, now pronounced his doom with supernatural authority that admitted no appeal. The final battle played out with tragic inevitability as Philistine warriors overwhelmed Israelite resistance through iron weapons, an organization that proved decisive against Bronze Age equipment and declining morale. Jonathan's death eliminated the one potential bridge between old and new administrations, as Saul's suicide prevented capture, though ensuring that judgment would be executed completely. The Philistine desecration of royal corpses exposed the fate awaiting any people whose rulers abandoned sacred allegiance for conventional solutions. The heads displayed in Philistine temples proclaimed the impotence of Israel's God, as the bodies hung on city walls warned other peoples against resistance to Philistine expansion. Only the heroic rescue by men of Jabesh Gilead, remembering Saul's first success in their defense, prevented complete humiliation by recovering the bodies for decent burial. David's response to news of Saul's death proved the magnanimity that would characterize his reign through political wisdom that understood the importance of national unity. His lament for Saul and Jonathan, "How the mighty have fallen," honored the previous administration, though avoiding any appearance of celebrating their destruction. The execution of the Amalekite who claimed credit for killing Saul served warning that David would not tolerate those who showed disrespect for sacred appointment, even when that appointment had failed. The division of the kingdom that followed Saul's death tested whether David's character would survive the temptations of power through tribal tensions that monarchy had been intended to resolve. His coronation as king of Judah at Hebron provided the constitutional foundation for reunification, as Ishbosheth's installation as king of the northern clans produced the political opposition that would require 7 years of civil war to resolve. The gradual shift of support from Ishbosheth to David reflected recognition that heavenly favor determined political success more than strategies or strength. Abner's defection following his quarrel with Ishbosheth over Rizpah brought the northern kingdom's most competent commander into David's camp, as Joab's assassination of Abner proved the blood feuds that complicated political reconciliation. David's reaction to Abner's murder, public mourning, and explicit condemnation of Joab's action maintained the moral high ground during prevention of northern rulers from viewing their former general's death as evidence of southern treachery. "Know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel," David declared, honoring his former enemy through distancing himself from those whose violence threatened national unity. The assassination of Ishbosheth by his own bodyguards eliminated the remaining obstacle to reunification through testing David's commitment to justice over political convenience. His execution of the murderers who expected reward for delivering his rival's head proved that sacred kingship required moral consistency regardless of personal advantage. The honor given to Ishbosheth's burial established precedent for treating former opponents with dignity that encouraged future reconciliation. The unanimous coronation at Hebron that made David king over all Israel represented more than political success. It was heavenly vindication of choices that had been made decades earlier when Samuel anointed the shepherd boy in his father's house. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. The capture of Jerusalem provided the new monarchy with a capital that transcended clan loyalties during establishment of the strategic position needed for effective governance. The Jebusite fortress that had resisted conquest for centuries fell to David's warriors through innovative tactics that exploited defensive weaknesses no previous attacker had discovered. More importantly, the city's location on the border between Judah and Benjamin made it neutral territory that could unite rather than divide the clans. David's transformation of Jerusalem from Jebusite stronghold into Israel's eternal capital reflected blessing operating through wisdom and supernatural intervention. The construction projects that followed, palace, walls, administrative buildings, built the infrastructure needed for effective government, as the arrival of skilled craftsmen from Tyre proved international recognition of the new kingdom's legitimacy. The Philistine response to David's coronation exposed their understanding that unified Israel posed existential threat to their expansion plans. The The two campaigns in the Valley of Rephaim tested whether favor that had elevated David to the throne would continue protecting him against superior technology. The victories that followed, achieved through supernatural strategy that turned Philistine strength against itself, eliminated the foreign threat that had driven Israel to demand monarchy during establishment of David's reputation as a commander whom blessing made invincible. The transfer of the Ark to Jerusalem represented the theological climax of David's rise to power during establishment of the spiritual foundations that would distinguish his kingdom from conventional ancient Near Eastern monarchies. The elaborate procession that brought the sacred symbol to its new resting place proved royal commitment to maintaining covenant relationship despite institutional change. Uzzah's death for touching the Ark during transport provided sobering reminder that holiness required careful observance of established protocols, even when circumstances seemed to justify innovation. David's initial anger at this interruption gradually gave way to reverent fear that led to 3 months of preparation before attempting to complete the transfer according to proper procedures. The successful installation of the Ark in the tent David prepared built the center that would define Jerusalem's significance for millennia. The king's dancing before the Ark with all his might proved personal devotion that transcended royal dignity through establishment of precedent for worship that engaged emotion as well as intellect. Mishkal's criticism of such undignified behavior exposed aristocratic sensibilities that misunderstood the relationship between sacred kingship and mortal authority. The Davidic covenant that followed represented response to royal desire to build a permanent temple during establishment of dynastic promises that would shape Jewish expectations throughout subsequent history. Nathan's initial approval of temple construction gave way to revelation that reversed planning, though expanding royal hopes beyond anything David had imagined. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, came the promise that transformed temporal monarchy into eternal dynasty. The assurance that love would never depart from David's house as it had from Saul's built theological foundation for messianic hope that would sustain Jewish faith through every subsequent crisis. David's prayer of response exposed humility that remained despite elevation to unprecedented power. Who am I, O Lord God? And what is my house that you have brought me this far? The king who commanded armies and ruled nations acknowledged himself as recipient of grace rather than architect of achievement, recognizing that choice rather than merit had elevated him from shepherd to sovereign. The campaigns that established Israel as the dominant regional power proved blessing, operating through strategic brilliance and tactical innovation. The systematic conquest of traditional enemies, Philistines, Moabites, Arameans, Ammonites, Edomites, built an empire stretching from the Euphrates to the borders of Egypt during generation of tribute that would fund Solomon's building projects. The war with Ammon that began with kindness offered to Hanun produced opportunity for David's greatest triumph during setting the stage for his greatest moral failure. The siege of Rabbah that dragged on for months provided the context for the Bathsheba affair that would cast shadows over the remainder of his reign. The rooftop encounter that led to adultery exposed how completely royal power could corrupt moral judgment when accountability structures failed to restrain sovereign desire. David's abuse of authority to arrange Uriah's death proved that covenant did not exempt kings from temptation, as royal position amplified the consequences of personal failure. Nathan's parable of the rich man who stole the poor man's lamb exposed the king's guilt during demonstration of prophetic courage that dared confront absolute power with sacred authority. You are the man. brought David face to face with the magnitude of his crimes during offering of opportunity for repentance that could restore favor despite failure. The judgment that followed, "The sword shall never depart from your house," proved that forgiveness did not eliminate temporal consequences of moral failure. Absalom's rebellion, Amnon's death, family conflicts that would plague the remainder of David's reign, all flowed from the example of violence and abuse that royal sin had established. David's response to discipline exposed character that distinguished him from Saul despite similar failures. Where Saul had shifted blame and justified disobedience, David accepted responsibility and submitted to consequences. "I have sinned against the Lord" became the foundation for restoration that transformed judgment into mercy during maintenance of justice. The rebellion that split David's kingdom exposed how quickly political success could be undermined when spiritual foundations were compromised. Absalom's beauty, charm, and apparent concern for justice attracted support from those who had grown disillusioned with royal administration, as his 4 years of careful preparation proved patience that made his eventual revolt nearly successful. The flight from Jerusalem that forced David to abandon his capital tested whether promises could survive failure during exposure of the loyalty that transcended political calculation. The priest's offer to carry the ark into exile received royal refusal that proved faith in sovereignty. "If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place." Shimei's cursing of the fleeing king provided opportunity for David to prove the spiritual maturity that suffering had produced. Where earlier in his reign he might have executed such insolence, the chastened monarch accepted abuse as potentially discipline. "Let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David.'" This humility before enemies reflected submission to will that enabled eventual restoration. The Battle of Ephraim Forest that destroyed Absalom's warriors proved that favor had not permanently departed despite royal failure. The supernatural assistance that enabled 20,000 casualties during preservation of David's smaller army proved covenant loyalty that transcended unfaithfulness, though maintaining standards that required justice. David's grief for Absalom exposed paternal love that transcended political necessity during production of crisis that threatened to destroy the success that had restored his throne. Joab's brutal confrontation. "You have shamed the faces of all your servants who today have saved your life," forced recognition that command required balancing personal emotion with public responsibility. The restoration that followed Absalom's defeat proved mercy, operating through forgiveness during establishment of precedent for reconciliation that could overcome even civil war. David's treatment of those who had supported rebellion, Shimei's pardon, Mephibosheth's restoration, even consideration for Barzillai's loyalty, exposed guidance that understood the importance of healing national divisions. The final years of David's reign saw the establishment of administrative systems that would enable Solomon's building projects during exposure of the institutional developments that transformed Israel from loose confederation into centralized monarchy. The organization that built professional armies loyal to the crown, the civil service that administered royal policy throughout the kingdom, the economic structures that generated revenue through taxation and tribute, all laid foundations for imperial expansion under his successor. The census that provoked judgment exposed how completely royal thinking had been transformed by success. The king, who had once depended entirely on intervention, now counted strength as though resources rather than favor determined national security. Joab's reluctance to conduct the enumeration reflected understanding that some royal commands violated spiritual principles regardless of administrative convenience. The plague that killed 70,000 Israelites proved that judgment could not be deflected by royal authority during exposure of mercy that limited destruction when genuine repentance emerged. David's willingness to accept personal responsibility for communal suffering. I am the one who has sinned and done evil indeed. But these sheep, what have they done? Exhibited guidance that protected followers even when royal decisions had produced danger. The threshing floor of Araunah that became the site for temple construction marked the transition from David's reign to Solomon's during establishment of the geographic center for worship that would define Jewish identity. The king's insistence on paying full price for the location. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which costs me nothing, proved understanding that meaningful worship required personal sacrifice. Solomon's anointing at Gihon as Adonijah, attempted coronation at Enrogel, represented the final test of David's wisdom during assurance of succession according to heavenly rather than preference. The prompt action that proclaimed Solomon king before Adonijah could consolidate support prevented civil war during demonstration. That effective guidance sometimes required decisive action that transcended conventional procedures. David's final instructions to Solomon combined practical wisdom with spiritual exhortation during exposure of recognition that institutional success required blessing more than capability. Be strong and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies. The execution of Joab and Shimei that followed David's death eliminated threats to Solomon's reign during fulfillment of justice that David's mercy had deferred. The new king's willingness to carry out policies his father had been unable to implement proved royal authority that could transcend personal relationships when political necessity demanded decisive action. Solomon's early demonstration of wisdom in the case of the disputed infant exposed blessing that would characterize his reign during establishment of international reputation for judgment that transcended conventional royal capabilities. The threat to divide the living child exposed the false claimant during preservation of the infant for its true mother, proving insight that penetrated deception through understanding of genuine love. The administrative reorganization that divided the kingdom into 12 districts, governed by appointed officials, built revenue system that funded unprecedented building projects during elimination of clan autonomy that had limited previous monarchs. Each district's responsibility to provide royal maintenance for 1 month annually generated resources that enabled Solomon to support 40,000 stalls of horses, elaborate court ceremonies, and construction projects that would amaze the ancient world. International relationships that began with marriage to Pharaoh's daughter proved Israel's elevation to great power status during production of diplomatic connections that facilitated trade and cultural exchange. The alliance that had seemed impossible during the Judges period now represented natural partnership between equals who shared interests in regional stability and commercial prosperity. The temple construction that dominated Solomon's reign represented the fulfillment of David's vision during production of architectural achievement that would define Jewish worship for millennia. The detailed specifications that governed every aspect of design, from foundation stones to golden vessels, emphasized holiness during demonstration of royal resources that could accomplish projects beyond conventional imagination. Hiram's provision of Lebanese cedar and skilled craftsmen exposed international recognition of Solomon's legitimacy during establishment of commercial relationships that benefited both kingdoms. The payments in wheat, oil, and territorial concessions built economic cooperation that transcended political boundaries during enablement of projects that neither kingdom could have accomplished independently. The 7 years required for temple completion proved royal commitment to excellence that refused shortcuts, despite enormous cost during exposure of organizational capabilities that coordinated complex logistics across multiple nations. The 183,300 workers employed in construction represented mobilization of resources that transformed Israel from agricultural society into industrial power capable of competing with established empires. The dedication ceremony that followed temple completion brought together representatives from throughout the known world during demonstration of acceptance of the structure that would become central to Jewish identity. Solomon's prayer acknowledged transcendence. Heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built. During request for blessing on the building that would serve as focal point for covenant relationship. The cloud that filled the temple proved approval during demonstration that earthly structures could provide dwelling place for heavenly presence when proper relationships were maintained. The glory that prevented priests from ministering exposed majesty during confirmation that Solomon's reign enjoyed supernatural blessing that distinguished it from merely achievement. The palace complex that required 13 years to complete established royal residence that rivaled achievements of surrounding empires during demonstration of wealth that surpassed anything previous Israelite rulers had imagined. The House of the Forest of Lebanon, the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of Judgment, and the royal residence built architectural statement that proclaimed Israel's arrival as regional superpower. The visit of the Queen of Sheba represented international recognition of Solomon's wisdom during demonstration of commercial relationships that extended Israel's influence throughout the known world. Her declaration that the half was not told me acknowledged achievements that exceeded even exaggerated reports during establishment of diplomatic connections that would benefit both kingdoms through expanded trade. The commercial empire that generated unprecedented wealth transformed Israel from pastoral society into international trading power during exposure of administrative capabilities that maximized every available resource. The gold that flowed from Ophir, the silver that became common as stones in Jerusalem, the exotic goods that arrived in merchant fleets all proved blessing operating through enterprise. The 666 talents of gold that comprised Solomon's annual income represented wealth that exceeded the resources of most entire kingdoms during funding of lifestyle that amazed contemporary observers. The shields of beaten gold, the ivory throne overlaid with pure gold, the vessels of gold rather than silver, all proved royal magnificence that proclaimed favor through material prosperity. The very success that elevated Solomon's reign to unprecedented heights contained seeds of destruction that would split the kingdom after his death. The forced labor that built magnificent structures produced resentment among northern clans who provided workers but received fewer benefits. The taxation that funded royal luxury imposed burdens that recalled oppression their ancestors had fought to escape. The marriages that sealed diplomatic alliances gradually compromised purity that had distinguished Israel from surrounding nations. Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines represented political connections that brought foreign gods into the very heart of the kingdom during demonstration of royal excess that violated standards for guidance. The high places that Solomon built for Chemosh, Molech, and other foreign deities represented apostasy that directly violated the first commandment during production of precedent for compromise that would plague every subsequent generation. The king who had built the magnificent temple to the Lord now sponsored worship of gods whose rituals included child sacrifice and ritual prostitution. Judgment that promised kingdom division exposed consequences that would outlast Solomon's lifetime during demonstration, that covenant obligations applied even to the most successful rulers. I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem which I have chosen. Adversaries who emerged during Solomon's later years foreshadowed troubles that would intensify after his death, during exposure of how quickly favor could be withdrawn when covenant obligations were abandoned. Hadad's return from exile, Rezin's establishment of Syrian independence, Jeroboam's growing influence among northern clans, all proved political instability that reflected spiritual apostasy. The heavy yoke that characterized Solomon's administration produced popular resentment that would demand relief under his successor during exposure of how completely royal priorities had shifted from service to self-aggrandizement. The magnificence that impressed foreign visitors oppressed domestic subjects who bore the cost through taxation, conscription, and forced labor that recalled the bondage their ancestors had escaped. Solomon's death after 40 years of reign marked the end of united monarchy during setting of stage for division that would test whether David's dynasty could survive the consequences of Solomonic excess. The kingdom that had reached unprecedented heights of wealth, power, and international recognition stood poised for fragmentation that would eliminate Israel as a great power during reduction of the descendants of Abraham to competing petty kingdoms vulnerable to foreign conquest. The irony was complete. The monarchy that had been demanded to make Israel like other nations had succeeded beyond all expectation, producing wealth, power, and international recognition that surpassed contemporary empires. In becoming like other nations, Israel had lost the distinctive relationship with God that had been the source of its strength. The very success that vindicated popular demands for conventional guidance contained the seeds of destruction that would teach future generations the cost of abandoning calling for earthly achievement. The empire that Solomon built through 4 decades of unprecedented prosperity died in a single day at Shechem. When Rehoboam arrived at the ancient city, where Joshua had once challenged the tribes to choose whom they would serve, he faced a choice that would determine whether David's dynasty could hold together the realm his father had created through wisdom, and his grandfather had forged through warfare. The representatives who met him there carried grievances that had festered throughout Solomon's reign, their patience exhausted by years of forced labor, crushing taxation, and royal magnificence purchased with their sweat and sacrifice. Jeroboam's return from Egyptian exile had electrified the breakaway tribes with possibilities they had barely dared imagine during Solomon's oppressive final years. This Ephraimite, whose administrative brilliance had once caught Solomon's attention before prophetic promises of future rule forced his flight to Pharaoh's court, now stood before the assembly as the embodiment of hopes for relief from southern domination. "Your father made our yoke heavy," Jeroboam declared, speaking for representatives who had gathered to air grievances that Solomon's magnificence had ignored. "Now, therefore, lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you." The demand was reasonable, the request modest, the tone respectful. Behind these diplomatic words lay an ultimatum that would test whether the united realm could evolve beyond the autocratic structures that had enabled Solomon's achievements while crushing popular spirit. Rehoboam's request for 3 days to consider their petition seemed wise, suggesting deliberation that weighed competing interests against national unity. The elders who had served Solomon counseled moderation, with the pragmatic wisdom of men who understood that authority rested ultimately on popular consent rather than inherited privilege. If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever." Instead, Rehoboam chose to consult the young men who had grown up with him in the palace, courtiers whose understanding had been shaped by observing Solomon's absolute power rather than experiencing the burdens such power imposed on those who bore its costs. Their counsel reflected the arrogance of privilege insulated from consequence, the short-sightedness of authority that had never been challenged. "My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist," came Rehoboam's response when the assembly reconvened, his words dripping with contempt for people whose labor had built the very palace where he had learned such arrogance. "My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges." The response was immediate and devastating. "What share have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David." The ancient cry that had once rallied tribal independence against Philistine oppression now shattered the united realm that 3 generations of Davidic rule had built. In choosing intimidation over reconciliation, Rehoboam had transformed opposition into revolution. The stoning of Adoram, Rehoboam's tribute officer, provided brutal punctuation to the Declaration of Independence, while demonstrating how completely royal control had collapsed outside Judah's borders. The man whose collection of forced labor had symbolized Solomonic oppression became the first casualty of civil war that would divide the people of Abraham for the next 2 centuries. The assembly at Shechem that proclaimed Jeroboam king over the breakaway tribes represented more than revolt. It was constitutional innovation that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority throughout the ancient Near East. Where conventional realms claimed legitimacy through hereditary succession or divine appointment, the new state based its power on popular consent expressed through representative assembly. Yet this very success created challenges that would plague the North throughout its tumultuous existence. Jeroboam faced the impossible task of building institutional legitimacy that could compete with the holy city's prestige, Davidic dynastic claims, and Solomon's sanctuary, which remained the focal point of covenant relationship for both realms. The golden calves that Jeroboam erected at Dan and Bethel represented desperate attempts to create alternatives that could match the temple's spiritual authority while maintaining theological orthodoxy. "It is too much for you to go up to the holy city," he declared, offering practical solutions to obligations that southern control had made dangerous. "Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt." The irony was bitter and the precedent ominous. The same words that had once described Aaron's golden calf during the Sinai rebellion now justified policy that claimed innovation while maintaining covenant faithfulness. Jeroboam's calves were intended as pedestals for the invisible presence of the Lord, rather than objects of worship themselves, following ancient Near Eastern traditions. Yet the distinction between symbol and idol, between innovation and apostasy, would prove impossible to maintain in practice. The priesthood that Jeroboam established completed the institutional separation that made reunion increasingly unlikely. Unable to rely on Levitical priests whose loyalties remained tied to the temple, he appointed clergy from among the common people who would serve crown policy rather than traditional covenant requirements. The festivals he instituted, like the feast that was in Judah but celebrated a month later, created parallel calendar that competed directly with the Holy City's ceremonial cycle. The Egyptian invasion that devastated both realms during Rehoboam's 5th year provided grim reminder that division had eliminated the strength that had made Solomon's empire a regional superpower. Shishak's campaign swept through both north and south with devastating effectiveness, capturing fortified cities and carrying away treasures that represented generations of accumulated wealth. The golden shields that Solomon had made for ceremonial occasions were replaced with bronze substitutes that symbolized the reduced circumstances both realms would endure as separate entities. The border wars that followed created the pattern of constant conflict that would characterize relations between the divided peoples throughout their parallel existence. The fortified cities that each realm built along their common frontier transformed what had once been administrative boundaries into militarized zones where brother fought brother for control of strategic positions and commercial routes. Jeroboam's 22-year rule established the precedents that would define northern identity, while revealing the structural weaknesses that would eventually destroy it. His success in maintaining independence against southern pressure proved northern viability, yet his innovations created theological problems that would plague every subsequent ruler. The sin of Jeroboam, worship at unauthorized sanctuaries served by illegitimate priests, became the standard by which prophetic literature would judge all future kings. The dynastic instability that followed Jeroboam's death exposed the constitutional weakness inherent in rule, based on popular consent rather than hereditary succession. Nadab's assassination, after only 2 years, initiated the pattern of violent succession that would characterize politics throughout the North's history. Baasha's extermination of Jeroboam's entire family fulfilled prophetic warnings while establishing precedent for dynastic elimination that would make stability impossible to achieve. Omri's emergence as victor in the succession struggle that required 4 years to resolve marked the beginning of recovery that would make the breakaway state a regional power. His purchase of the Hill of Samaria and construction of a new seat demonstrated strategic vision that placed the royal residence on defensible terrain while creating impressive architectural statement of independence. The new city's commanding position, overlooking major trade routes, proclaimed determination to control economic destiny, rather than accepting subordination to the South's commercial interests. International recognition of legitimacy came through Omri's alliance with Phoenician Tyre, sealed by his son Ahab's marriage to Jezebel, daughter of the Sidonian king Ethbaal. This diplomatic revolution connected the state to Mediterranean commercial networks, while providing access to Phoenician maritime technology, craftsmanship, and cultural sophistication. Ahab's accession inaugurated the most dramatic period in the North's history, as spiritual conflict intensified into open confrontation between prophetic authority and crown policy. Jezebel's influence introduced aggressive promotion of Baal worship that went far beyond Jeroboam's pragmatic innovations, threatening to eliminate covenant relationship entirely in favor of Canaanite fertility practices. The 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table represented systematic attempt to replace traditional leadership with foreign-trained clergy. Elijah's emergence as prophetic champion against this apostasy transformed conflict into national crisis that tested whether covenant relationship could survive royal abandonment. His declaration that no rain would fall except at his word challenged both Baal's reputation as storm deity and crown authority to determine policy. The 3.5-year drought that followed vindicated prophetic claims while creating economic devastation that touched every aspect of society. The contest at Mount Carmel provided definitive proof of divine power, while exposing the impotence of foreign deities that crown policy had promoted. Elijah's careful preparation, the altar repair using 12 stones representing tribal unity, the repeated drenching that eliminated any possibility of fraud, the prayer that acknowledged sovereignty, created conditions where supernatural intervention would be unmistakable. The fire that consumed sacrifice, stones, and water, while igniting popular enthusiasm for covenant renewal, demonstrated that the Lord remained Israel's God despite royal apostasy. The massacre of Baal's prophets that followed eliminated organized leadership for foreign practices that Crown policy had promoted. Yet Jezebel's threat against Elijah's life forced the prophet into exile, proving that triumph in spiritual warfare required sustained support that prophetic authority alone could not provide. Ahab's death at Ramoth-Gilead eliminated the strongest ruler while leaving conflicts unresolved and Syrian pressure mounting. His son, Ahaziah's brief rule ended in fatal injury that prompted consultation with Baal-zebub of Ekron rather than Israel's God, demonstrating how thoroughly royal apostasy had progressed. Jehu's anointing as king through prophetic agency marked the end of Omride dynasty while inaugurating revolution that would eliminate Baal worship through systematic violence. The secret ceremony that Elisha's student conducted in the army camp at Ramoth-Gilead created legitimate alternative to existing authority while providing divine sanction for revolutionary action. The chariot pursuit that brought Jehu to Jezreel demonstrated the efficiency that made his revolution successful, while fulfilling prophetic warnings that had been pronounced decades earlier. Joram's death by Jehu's arrow at Naboth's vineyard provided poetic justice for crimes that had violated both property rights and judicial procedures. Jezebel's defiant appearance at her window, adorned with makeup and elaborate hairstyle that proclaimed royal dignity even in defeat, demonstrated courage that transcended differences while providing dramatic conclusion to the foreign influence that had shaped policy for decades. Her death by defenestration, followed by consumption by dogs, fulfilled Elijah's prophecy while eliminating the driving force behind Baal promotion. The massacre of Ahab's 70 sons, whose heads were delivered to Jezreel in baskets, completed the dynastic elimination that revolution required. The slaughter of Ahab's relatives, friends, and court officials extended purge beyond the royal family to include all who had supported Omride policies. The Baal worshippers who gathered at the temple in response to Jehu's deceptive invitation to a great sacrifice met systematic destruction that eliminated organized foreign practice from the territory. The transformation of Baal's sanctuary into a latrine provided symbolic conclusion to revolution while demonstrating Jehu's determination to make restoration impossible. Yet the preservation of Jeroboam's golden calves revealed the calculations that limited reform to elimination of foreign elements while maintaining independence from the south. The Assyrian tribute that Jehu paid to Shalmaneser III, documented on the black obelisk discovered at Nimrud, marked entry into the imperial system that would eventually destroy independence. The relief carvings that show Jehu or his representative prostrating before the Assyrian king, while presenting tribute, demonstrate the humiliating diplomatic position that revolution's aftermath had created. Jehu's 28-year rule established orthodoxy, while revealing the costs that revolution had imposed on society. The elimination of Phoenician alliance through Jezebel's death reduced commercial opportunities that had funded Omride prosperity. The hostility from Judah that resulted from Ahaziah's death eliminated cooperation that had enabled joint resistance to Syrian expansion. The Syrian conquests that characterized Jehu's later years demonstrated how isolation had weakened strategic position while revealing divine judgment operating through foreign success. Hazael's systematic reduction of territory east of the Jordan eliminated agricultural resources while forcing population displacement that weakened potential. The rapid succession of kings that followed demonstrated instability that prosperity had temporarily masked, while foreign pressures mounted beyond capacity to resist. Zechariah's 6-month rule ended in public assassination. Shallum's month-long usurpation was terminated by Menahem's intervention from Tirzah. These violent transitions showed constitutional weakness, while external enemies prepared to exploit internal divisions. Menahem's 10-year rule brought temporary stability through systematic brutality that crushed internal opposition, while accepting Assyrian dominance that reduced independence to nominal self-government. The tribute of 1,000 talents of silver that he paid to Tiglath-Pileser required unprecedented taxation that forced wealthy landowners to contribute 50 shekels each for royal survival. The Assyrian policy of supporting compliant rulers while eliminating those who resisted imperial interests created impossible dilemmas for leadership that needed to maintain both popular support and foreign approval. Pekah's alliance with Syrian Damascus against Assyrian expansion demonstrated determination to recover independence through coalition, despite overwhelming odds against success. The deportation that followed Tiglath-Pileser's campaign reduced the realm to the hill country around the new seat, while establishing imperial provinces in Galilee, Gilead, and other territories that had supported anti-Assyrian resistance. The loss of these agricultural and commercial regions eliminated much of the economic base that had sustained independence, while population transfers weakened ethnic unity that might have supported future resistance. Hoshea's installation as Assyrian vassal following Pekah's assassination represented imperial recognition that independence had effectively ended despite continued nominal autonomy. His eventual attempt to gain Egyptian support against Assyrian demands showed that hope for freedom persisted even when practical possibilities for successful resistance had virtually disappeared. The final siege that began in 725 BC and lasted 3 years represented the last desperate attempt to maintain existence as an independent entity. The city's strong fortifications and determined defenders prolonged resistance longer than Assyrian planners had anticipated. Yet the outcome was never seriously in doubt once imperial armies surrounded the seat. The 27,290 people who were deported to distant regions of the Assyrian Empire, according to royal inscriptions, represented the skilled craftsmen, administrative personnel, and potential leadership that might have maintained distinct identity in exile. Their dispersal among Mesopotamian and Iranian populations ensured gradual assimilation that eliminated tribal identity within a few generations. The foreign colonists who were brought to settle depopulated territories created the mixed population that would later be known as Samaritans. The lost tribes that captured later imagination represented the historical reality that successful imperial policy could eliminate entire peoples through demographic engineering that destroyed cultural continuity while preventing organized resistance to foreign rule. The state that had maintained independence for over 2 centuries disappeared as completely as though it had never existed, leaving only archaeological remains and biblical records to preserve memory of its achievements and failures. The southern realm of Judah that survived the catastrophe inherited both the responsibility for preserving covenant relationship and the warning of what awaited those who abandoned divine calling for earthly advantage. The lesson was clear, the precedent ominous, the choice unavoidable. Independence required spiritual faithfulness, and material prosperity without moral foundation led inevitably to national destruction. The North's fate would serve as prophetic warning for every subsequent generation that possessed the freedom to choose between covenant loyalty and cultural accommodation. The smoke was still rising from Samaria's ruins when a delegation arrived at Hezekiah's court with urgent news. The northern realm that had defied Assyrian power for 3 years was gone. 27,000 of their brothers had been marched into exile, scattered across an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. The lost tribes would never return. Now the southern kingdom stood alone, the last flickering flame of David's dynasty, the final guardian of Solomon's sanctuary, the sole remnant of the people who had once conquered Canaan under Joshua's banner. King Hezekiah received the news in the shadow of the very house his ancestor had built, its golden vessels still gleaming in the morning light, its priests still offering daily sacrifices that had continued unbroken for 2 centuries. But everyone in the holy city understood the unspoken question that hung heavy in the incense-laden air. How long before Assyrian armies surrounded these walls? How long before the sacred treasures were loaded onto carts bound for Nineveh? The answer seemed to come with terrifying swiftness. Sennacherib's forces swept through the land like a plague, capturing 46 fortified cities and carrying away 200,150 people, according to the Assyrian king's own boastful records. City after city opened its gates in surrender. Fortress after fortress fell to siege engines that had perfected their deadly craft on a dozen campaigns. Yet Hezekiah chose faith over fear, sacred loyalty over political calculation. When Assyrian negotiators stood beneath the capital's walls and shouted their ultimatum in Hebrew so that every defender could understand, "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord." The king's response came not through diplomatic channels, but through desperate prayer in Solomon's sanctuary. Isaiah's prophecy arrived like thunder in the darkness. "Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and he shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city, to save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake." That night, the angel of death walked through the Assyrian camp. When dawn broke over the city's walls, 185,000 of the empire's finest soldiers lay dead in their tents. Sennacherib, who had boasted that he would make the Lord as powerless as the deities of Damascus and Samaria, fled back to Nineveh, where his own sons would eventually murder him in his sanctuary. The lesson was unmistakable, the precedent hopeful, the relationship vindicated. When kings trusted in the Lord rather than in horses and chariots, when they relied on divine promises rather than human alliances, even the mightiest empire on earth could not stand against them. Hezekiah's triumph became the defining moment that proved God's promise to David was still in force. Yet the very success that saved the holy city also planted seeds of spiritual complacency that would poison future generations. Hezekiah's son Manasseh inherited a throne secured by divine intervention, a capital enriched by Assyrian withdrawal, a realm convinced of its own invincibility. For 55 years, he transformed the capital into a center of every abomination that the law had forbidden. Altars to foreign gods sprouted in the sacred courts where Solomon had once offered pure sacrifices. Child sacrifice resumed in the valley of Hinnom. Witchcraft and divination replaced prophetic counsel, as royal policy was shaped by mediums rather than the word of the Lord. The prophetic voices that dared to protest this apostasy were silenced through persecution so systematic that tradition records Isaiah himself being sawn in two during Manasseh's rule. The people who had been delivered from Assyrian destruction now faced divine judgment that would prove far more terrible than any earthly empire could inflict. "I will stretch over the capital the measuring line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab," came the verdict through prophets whose names have been forgotten. I will wipe it as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. Josiah's accession at 8 years old offered one final opportunity for repentance and restoration. This young king launched the most comprehensive reform in the nation's history. The high places that had corrupted worship for centuries were destroyed. The foreign altars that had polluted the sanctuary were removed. The mediums and spiritists who had replaced prophetic guidance were expelled from the land. The discovery of the Book of the Law during renovation provided dramatic confirmation that reform was both necessary and urgent. When the scroll was read before King Josiah, he tore his clothes in recognition of how far the nation had strayed from divine requirements. The Passover that followed became the greatest since Samuel's time, drawing pilgrims from throughout the land for observance of the feast that commemorated their ancestors' deliverance from bondage. Yet even Josiah's exemplary faithfulness could not undo the accumulated guilt of generations that had broken every obligation, while presuming upon divine mercy. His death at Megiddo, while attempting to intercept Pharaoh Necho's march, marked the end of hope for peaceful reform. The 4 kings who followed would preside over the final collapse of everything their ancestors had built. Jehoiakim's rebellion against Babylon transformed the kingdom from a Syrian vassal to target, while demonstrating the political blindness that divine judgment produces. His decision to align with Egypt reflected the same calculation that had destroyed the northern realm, trusting in human alliances rather than divine protection. The first siege in 597 BC ended in surrender that stripped the sanctuary of its treasures, while carrying away 10,000 of the nation's most skilled craftsmen, administrators, and potential leaders. Young Ezekiel was among the exiles who began their long captivity beside Babylon's rivers. The golden vessels that Solomon had crafted for divine worship now decorated Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Zedekiah's appointment as vassal king provided one last opportunity for wisdom to prevail over pride. The weeping prophet's constant warnings, "Serve the king of Babylon and live," offered a path that could have saved the city, the sanctuary, and the people. Yet false prophets who promised swift liberation proved more persuasive than the voice whose tears reflected divine sorrow over the capital's approaching doom. The final rebellion began with secret negotiations between Zedekiah and Egypt, the same nation that had enslaved Abraham's descendants a millennium earlier. The irony was devastating. In seeking freedom from occupation, the people were turning for help to the very power from which the Lord had delivered them through Moses. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and merciless. The siege that began in 588 BC lasted 18 months, reducing the population to starvation, while systematic destruction eliminated every aspect of normal life. Mothers ate their own children, as famine reached depths that Deuteronomy had warned would accompany abandonment. The city that had been called beautiful for situation became a charnel house where death stalked every street. The walls that had protected the capital since David's conquest were breached on the 9th day of the 4th month in 586 BC. Soldiers poured through the gaps like water through a broken dam, their torches setting fire to everything that centuries of faithful kings had built. The palace that had housed David's dynasty burned throughout the night. But the ultimate tragedy was yet to come. On the 7th day of the 5th month, Nebuzaradan arrived with orders that would end the system that had connected heaven and earth since Solomon's dedication. The sanctuary was stripped of its remaining treasures. The bronze pillars, the molten sea, the golden lampstands, the altar of incense. Every precious thing dedicated to divine service was broken in pieces and carried away. Then came the fire. The house that Solomon had built for the name of the Lord, where the ark had rested, where divine presence had dwelt among the people, where 1,000 years of prayers had ascended like incense. All was consumed in flames that rose toward heaven like a final sacrifice. The building that had been the center of the people's spiritual life was reduced to blackened stones and bitter ash. Zedekiah's capture, while fleeing toward Jericho, provided a fitting conclusion to the dynasty that had begun with such promise. His sons were slaughtered before his eyes, ensuring that no descendant would continue David's line on the throne. His own eyes were then put out, making the murder of his children the last sight he would ever see. The king who had broken faith with both divine and human authority was led away in bronze chains to die in prison, blind and broken. The deportation that followed eliminated the remnant of leadership, while scattering the people among nations as Moses had warned would happen if they forsook the sacred relationship. The number who went into exile, some 4,600 according to careful count, represented the educated class, the skilled workers, the priests and prophets who had maintained Israel's distinctive identity. Those who remained in the devastated land were largely the poor and unskilled, unable to preserve the traditions that had defined their ancestors. Gedaliah's brief governorship and subsequent assassination completed the political destruction that Conquest had begun. The remnant who fled to Egypt against the prophet's warnings carried the weeping voice with them into exile, his final prophecies unheeded, his tears unavailing. The land that had once flowed with milk and honey lay desolate, its cities ruined, its sanctuary destroyed, its people scattered to the four winds. The story that had begun with Abraham's journey from Ur to Canaan had come full circle. The descendants who had been called out from pagan nations to be a holy people had been scattered back among those same nations as judgment for their unfaithfulness. The land that had been promised as an eternal inheritance lay empty under foreign rule. The relationship that had been the source of their strength had been broken by the very people it was meant to bless. Yet in the darkness of exile, in the ashes of the holy city, in the silence where the sanctuary once rang with songs of praise, the story was not truly ending, but transforming. Ezekiel's visions by the river Chebar spoke of dry bones that would live again. Letters to the exiles promised that 70 years would bring restoration. Daniel's prayers in Babylon's palace demonstrated that divine presence was not confined to Solomon's house, but could be found wherever faithful hearts sought the Lord. The physical realm was destroyed, the political independence was lost, the sanctuary was burned, the land was desolate. But the promises remained, the prophetic words endured, the hope of restoration flickered like a flame that no amount of darkness could extinguish. The people who had begun as wandering Arameans would learn to sing the Lord's songs in foreign lands, while remembering the city where God had chosen to place his name. From the ruins to the rivers of Babylon, from the ashes to the courts of foreign kings, the story would continue. Not as a tale of political achievement or territorial conquest, but as the epic of a people chosen for divine purposes that transcended every earthly power, sustained by promises that outlasted every temporal disappointment, destined for restoration that would vindicate every hope their ancestors had cherished in faith. The exile was not the end. It was the beginning of something new.